What if a single bullet had missed? What if a trembling hand had faltered just long enough to change history? It's a sunny afternoon in Dallas. November 22, 1963. The crowds are smiling, cheering. President John F. Kennedy is waving from the back of an open-top limousine. He leans toward Jackie. A split second later, gunfire shatters the illusion of peace. But not in this world. In this world, he survives. The bullet that was meant to silence him ricochets off the edge of the car. Chaos erupts. Secret Service agents tackle him to the floor. Blood, but it's not his. He's shaken, not shattered. And America holds its breath. That's where everything begins to change. By the time the motorcade reaches Parkland Hospital, the news has already hit every radio. President Kennedy, alive. Within hours, footage of the attempt floods black and white televisions. A nation watches, stunned, as their young, charismatic leader addresses them, bandaged, pale, but standing. I have seen death. And now, I see purpose. The words are short, but they land like thunder. Kennedy isn't just surviving. He's transformed. He begins speaking of shadows within. Not just foreign threats, but domestic ones. Enemies in plain sight. And suddenly, people are listening. But not everyone is cheering. Behind the curtains of power, unease spreads. There were people, powerful people, who benefited from his silence. War contractors, oil magnates, intelligence officers who whispered in dark corners. And now? He's coming back stronger. And he's looking inward. That's when the real war begins. Not in Vietnam, not in Cuba, but in Washington. JFK's survival becomes a myth reborn. Crowds swell. Youth movements reignite. He speaks of civil rights, not as a problem, but as a moral reckoning. He calls for universal health care, for disarmament, for peace with the Soviets. He calls for the impossible. And for the first time, he starts to believe he can win. But let's rewind. What does a living Kennedy mean for Vietnam? It means hesitation, caution, a deep mistrust of the generals urging escalation. By 1964, when others are calling for more troops, Kennedy pushes for withdrawal. Quietly, but firmly. No more body bags for an unwinnable war, he says behind closed doors. And yet, opposition builds. The military-industrial complex doesn't like slow wars. It likes profitable ones. Rumors swirl. CIA whispers of instability. Leaks to the press. Political sabotage. But JFK isn't playing their game anymore. After Dallas, something in him snapped. He starts replacing key advisors. Old war hawks are pushed out. Bobby Kennedy becomes his closest confidant, again. Together, they begin a quiet revolution. And the dominoes begin to fall. By 1965, thousands of American troops are coming home, not going in. The war in Vietnam doesn't end overnight. But it never becomes the quagmire we remember. Number 58,000 dead Americans. No draft protests. No Kent State. The world's bloodiest headlines simply never happen. But peace abroad creates conflict at home. Kennedy's refusal to go to war sends shockwaves through Congress. Accusations of weakness, of betrayal. And then, Martin Luther King Jr. comes to the White House. The image is electric. Two men, symbols of change, standing side by side. Kennedy doesn't just endorse civil rights. He champions them. And suddenly, the South erupts. Segregationists call him a traitor. Governors talk of secession. But JFK doesn't flinch. In 1965, the Civil Rights Act passes under his hand, not Lyndon Johnson's. And with it, the political map begins to fracture. The Democratic Party splits. The Republican Party sees an opening. And America? It begins to tear at the seams. But Kennedy, he leans in. He believes a new generation will rise to replace the old. And for a while, it works. By the 1964 election, he wins re-election. Not in a landslide, but with a mandate. The youth adore him. Minorities see him as a beacon. But in the shadows, enemies regroup. The FBI begins monitoring him more closely. J. Edgar Hoover never liked Kennedy. And now, with Bobby heading the Department of Justice again, Hoover sees his influence slipping. The files grow thicker. Surveillance ramps up. And somewhere, deep within the bowels of the government, there are voices asking, did we fail in Dallas? But let's pause. What about the space race? In our world, it took a decade to land on the moon. But with Kennedy alive, inspired, obsessed, NASA is on fire. By 1968, humanity touches the lunar surface not with hesitation, but with triumph. Not just as a Cold War win, but as a symbol of unity. Kennedy stands on TV, older now, gray at the edges, and declares, "We came in peace, for all mankind." It's not just a moment. It's a rebirth of faith. In science. In progress. In the future. But history never moves in straight lines. As Kennedy's second term wanes, cracks appear. His idealism turns to stubbornness. He alienates business leaders. He calls for sweeping reforms that terrify Wall Street. Universal basic income, environmental regulations, gun control. And suddenly, the same voices who cheered in '63 begin to whisper. Too far. Too fast. Bobby, meanwhile, prepares to run in '68. But this time, he's not an outsider. He's a successor. But here's where it twists again. Because without JFK's death, there is no martyrdom. No Camelot myth. No golden aura. He's a man now. With flaws. With enemies. With scandals. Allegations surface. Of infidelity. Of corruption. Of backroom deals. And the media? No longer charmed. They go for the throat. By 1968, America is torn. Kennedy fatigue has set in. The youth still rally, but the rest grow wary. And then, tragedy strikes. A bomb explodes at a rally in Detroit. Dozens injured. The country stunned. Extremists claim responsibility, but the real message is clear. Hope has enemies, even when it survives a bullet. JFK, shaken, speaks from the Oval Office. They tried to silence me once. They failed. They tried again, not with bullets but with fear. They will fail again. It's powerful, raw, but also tired. The dream that survived Dallas is fading. Not because of violence, but because of erosion. Ideals, when tested long enough, begin to fray. And Kennedy, he feels it. He starts to withdraw. Public appearances grow rare. His speeches turn somber. Less fire. More reflection. He speaks of legacy. Of mistakes. Of roads not taken. And by the end of 1968, he tells Bobby quietly, "This country doesn't need another Kennedy. It needs a new dreamer." And he steps aside. But what if he hadn't? What if he passed the torch, and the flames still caught fire? Bobby runs. And this time, he runs with wind at his back. He doesn't have to conjure hope from the ashes of tragedy, he inherits it. But hope, in 1968, is a fragile thing. The cities are restless. The South is burning. The war in Vietnam hasn't vanished, only shrunk. American soldiers still bleed, just not as many. Still, Bobby preaches what his brother embodied: compassion, justice, reconciliation. He walks into Watts, not flanked by armed guards, but with open hands. He speaks in Harlem, not like a politician, but like a brother. And for a moment, just a moment, America believes again. But the machine doesn't rest. Behind the scenes, opposition mobilizes. Old power doesn't vanish. It waits. The 1968 election becomes a battlefield of ideals. On one side, Bobby Kennedy, heir to a living legend. On the other, Richard Nixon, calculated, ruthless, determined to reclaim order. And order is what many Americans crave. They're tired of protests, tired of change, tired of Kennedys. Still, the race tightens. Town by town, state by state, until the final days, when the unthinkable happens. A scandal breaks. Not Bobby's, his brother's. Leaked recordings from the Oval Office. Comments JFK made in private. Bitter, crude, damning. The myth of the noble survivor is shattered. Bobby tries to distance himself. "I am not my brother's keeper," he says. But the damage is done. On election night, Nixon wins. Barely. And with that, the Kennedy era ends, not in gunfire, but in silence. JFK retires to Cape Cod. A shadow of the man who once defied death. He writes, reflects, fades. But the world he changed continues to ripple. Without the full-scale Vietnam War, Southeast Asia never collapses into chaos. Cambodia doesn't fall to the Khmer Rouge. Laos remains sovereign. And the draft? A relic of the past. In the U.S., civil rights continue to advance, slowly, messily, but without being drowned in the blood of 1968. Martin Luther King Jr., inspired by a living Kennedy, pushes further. He lives longer. Perhaps even until the 1980s. In space? The moon becomes a beginning, not an end. By 1975, the U.S. launches the first permanent orbital lab. By 1983, a Kennedy-funded initiative begins talks of a Mars mission. It doesn't launch, but the dream remains alive. Meanwhile, the Cold War cools, not by accident, but design. Kennedy's earlier détente with Khrushchev, built on survival and dialogue, softens the Soviet edge. The Cuban Missile Crisis? It still happened, but it wasn't the breaking point. Because Kennedy remembered what it meant to almost die, and never wanted to come that close again. And so, the world takes a different shape. By the 1980s, instead of a world defined by Reagan's brinkmanship, we have a colder but quieter balance. Still tense, still divided, but not always on the edge of nuclear death. JFK dies in 1985. Peacefully. In his sleep. A statesman. A father. No assassination. No eternal flame on a hill. His funeral is attended by millions. But not with the shock of tragedy. With the ache of farewell. And yet, the question remains. Was the world truly better with him alive? It's tempting to say yes. Less war. More progress. No Vietnam inferno. No Watergate scandal. No cultural collapse. But Kennedy's survival created different scars. Without his martyrdom, the myth never hardened into legend. Without his death, America never had a sacred story to cling to. The Kennedy years dragged on, not as a golden era, but as a contested one. He lived long enough to become controversial. To be questioned, criticized, to watch his ideals used, twisted, abandoned. And in that sense, he became something rare. Not a symbol, not a saint, a man, flawed, fierce, fearless, and ultimately, forgotten by some. So what if he had died that day? Would we remember him better? Would America have burned brighter in mourning than it ever did in reality? It's the cruel paradox of history. Sometimes, the dead inspire more than the living ever could. And yet, ask the families who never buried sons in Vietnam. Ask the activists who marched with MLK, not behind a casket. Ask the scientists who launched dreams into the stars. They might say, quietly, defiantly, it was better this way. Because Kennedy didn't just live. He changed what living meant. He proved that survival isn't weakness. That enduring, the pain, the scrutiny, the failures, is a kind of courage all its own. And in that courage, the world learned something profound. A bullet can stop a heart. But it can't stop an idea. In the decades that followed, the memory of John F. Kennedy became less about the myth, and more about the man. Schools taught his speeches, yes. But not with halos. With context. Students debated his policies, not just admired his smile. Historians wrestled with his legacy. Some praised his restraint. Others condemned his idealism. And always, there was the question. Did surviving the bullet make him greater, or just human? But behind the scenes, his influence endured. Many of his policies, once seen as radical, became mainstream over time. Healthcare reforms, desegregation efforts, nuclear arms treaties, ideas that once branded him soft, became blueprints for stability. And then there was the Kennedy Institute. Founded in the late 70s, funded with his post-presidency royalties and global donations, it became a think tank, not of war strategy, but peace strategy. Conflict resolution, diplomacy, human rights. Presidents after him, even those who had opposed him, often quoted him. Not the glamorous lines, but the hard ones. The time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining. Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. And that's where the deepest ripple may have formed. Because Kennedy, alive, had time to warn, not just of war, but of decay. By the 1980s, as America faced new threats, economic downturns, urban decline, rising cynicism, it was the Kennedy generation that stood in office. Governors, senators, judges, men and women raised on the example of someone who didn't die for a cause, but lived for one. Yet living for something is harder. There were moments when Kennedy nearly gave up. Letters from that era, revealed years later, show a man questioning everything. Did he pull out of Vietnam too early? Did he push civil rights too hard, too fast? Did he underestimate the machine that worked so tirelessly to grind progress to dust? In one note to Bobby, dated 1974, he writes, "They want a father, not a fighter. I gave them a storm. It wasn't bitterness. It was clarity." He saw how the dream of America wasn't just under threat from guns or bombs, but from comfort, from fear, from forgetting, because a dream, once achieved, begins to fade unless it's renewed. And for Kennedy, that renewal had to come from others. He understood, in his final years, that leadership is never permanent. It's a torch, and it burns the hand that holds it too long. So he let it go. By the time the Berlin Wall came down, Kennedy had been gone 5 years. But his voice echoed in the chants of protesters. His image, faded, grainy, was still held on banners in Prague, in East Berlin, in Seoul. To them, he wasn't the flawed leader. He was the man who dared to say, "Ich bin ein Berliner." He wasn't a myth. He was proof that power could be used to lift, not crush. And yet, not all lessons were learned. In the 1990s, the US faced new wars. Iraq, the Balkans, Somalia. Some argued that Kennedy's caution had made America weak. Others said his restraint had prevented worse. And once again, the nation was split. But this time, something was different. Public pressure mattered more. Protests swayed more votes. Perhaps because people remembered a time when one president had actually listened. Because he'd almost died. And death teaches you to hear. Even in fiction, Kennedy's survival became a theme. Books, films, alternate timelines. Some celebrated his vision. Others painted him as a tragic figure, a man who outlived his purpose. And maybe that's the truest fate of any survivor. You don't live to be adored. You live to be tested. And tested he was. By the end, Kennedy was neither a savior nor a tyrant. He was something rarer. He was real. That's what America needed. Not another martyr, but a mirror. He showed the country its light and its cracks. He forced it to face the question it always avoids. What happens when a dream lives long enough to face reality? And what do we do with that dream once it becomes flawed? You see, had he died that day in Dallas, he would have remained frozen in time. Perfect, untouchable. But by living, he gave us something more painful and more powerful. A chance to grow with him, to challenge him, to be disappointed, to still choose hope anyway. It's easy to mourn a fallen hero. Harder to follow a living one. Because the living contradict you. They change. They fail. They make compromises that legends never had to make. And Kennedy, he made plenty. He didn't end poverty. He didn't end racism. He didn't bring world peace. But he made people believe they could try. And sometimes, that belief was enough to shift history. Think of a young woman in Atlanta who saw him stand with Dr. King and decided to run for city council. Think of a scientist in Houston who saw him tour the Space Center and decided to build a new kind of engine. Think of a young man in Chicago, angry and disillusioned, who watched Kennedy walk through the streets after a riot. Not with a speech, but with silence, and decided not to throw a brick. These aren't headlines. They're echoes. The quiet revolutions that never make the front page, but shape the world anyway. And Kennedy's life was full of those echoes. He didn't always hear them. Some days, he thought he'd failed. But the truth was this: every moment he lived past Dallas was a defiance. Not just against the bullet, but against the narrative it was meant to write. Because that shot on November 22 wasn't just meant to end a man. It was meant to end an era. An era of possibility, of vision, of daring to ask, why not? But Kennedy took that question and lived it for another 20 years. And the cost? Loneliness, pressure, the slow erosion of innocence. His marriage, already strained, nearly broke in the 70s. His relationship with his children was distant, marked by duty more than warmth. He became increasingly wary of crowds. Suspicious, guarded, because once you've been hunted, you never truly feel safe again. Yet even in isolation, he never stopped thinking. His journals, released posthumously, are filled with late-night thoughts. Ideas, doubts, confessions. One entry reads, "Power reveals a man's character. But it also destroys it. I am no longer who I was in 1960. But perhaps that is the point." He knew he had changed. He had to. The world was not waiting for a boyish smile or a perfect speech. It needed someone who had looked into the abyss and chosen to keep walking. And that choice, every day, became his quiet legacy. Not the speeches, not the parades, not even the moon landing, but the choice to live, to endure, to face disappointment again and again, and still get up. Because that's the real fight, isn't it? Not dying for your country, but living with it, living through its failures, its betrayals, its ugly truths, and still saying, "I believe." That's what Kennedy gave us, not a golden age, but a mirror and a challenge. He didn't make America perfect. He made it uncomfortable. He asked too much, moved too fast, demanded too many answers. But in doing so, he taught us how to demand them, too. He taught us that leadership isn't about being adored. It's about standing in the storm, even when the crowd walks away. And for every critic who said he fell short, there was a child in a classroom, watching that grainy footage of him refusing to back down, and thinking, maybe I can stand, too. So here's the haunting truth. If Kennedy had died that day, we would have built statues. But because he lived, we built expectations. And expectations are harder to carry than marble. Yet he carried them, not always gracefully, not always successfully, but long enough to hand them to the next generation with trembling, open hands. He didn't give us the answers. He gave us the questions. And maybe that was enough. Years later, a child asks her grandfather, "Why do they still talk about Kennedy?" The old man smiles, not because he remembers a perfect president, but because he remembers possibility. Because he made us ask better questions, he says. That's the legacy. Not a monument, not a moment frozen in time, but a spark that refused to die. In another universe, he's shot. He dies. The motorcade drives on without him. And history marches in a different direction. But in this story, the one we dared to imagine, he lived. And living changed everything. The butterfly wings of his survival reshaped more than politics. It shifted our sense of what was possible. Not because he was superhuman, but because he wasn't. Because he fell, he broke, he got up. And in that rhythm, in that rise after the fall, we found something deeper than myth. We found a mirror, one that asked us not to worship, but to follow. Not to wait for a savior, but to act. That's the quiet revolution of a life continued. It lacks the fire of martyrdom, but it lights a longer path. A path where leaders don't vanish when things get hard. Where idealism isn't killed at the first sign of resistance. Where survival is strength, not shame. And in that survival, we find our own courage. Because we're all dodging bullets. Some visible, some not. Grief, failure, doubt, fear. And still, we move forward. Like he did. We ask more of ourselves. We challenge what's easy. We demand better, of our country, of our leaders, of our own hearts. Not because a man once gave a perfect speech, but because he lived long enough to take responsibility for it. So the next time someone asks you about Kennedy, don't speak of the limousine. Don't speak of the gunfire. Speak of the years after. The choices, the struggle, the courage. Because in the end, that's the legacy of the man who survived the bullet. He didn't leave us a legend. He left us a map. And it's still unfolding. If you felt something, if this made you wonder, subscribe. Because history doesn't end. It asks. What if you were there to change it?